Jews, but also the rest of human civilization. The first instinct we have in responding to extreme pain, and especially the kind of extreme pain that catches us by surprise, is to scream. Sometimes we cry, sometimes we lament, but we scream. The Rambam makes screaming into a mitzvah. Liz'ok uleharia al kol tzara shetavo, an obligation that we scream out, blow the shofar, about any terrible situation that arises. The act of screaming may also have therapeutic effects. According to some researchers, screaming has an effect of distracting the brain, sending conflicting messages about what you're saying out loud as opposed to what you're feeling. But I want to talk about screaming at the outset here as a kind of pre-rational act, one that can't be explained merely medically and exists in the world before rabbis can turn it into an obligation that a person has to do. In the language of Jewish, and as expressed by so many Jews in our history, screaming oftentimes sounds a lot like Psalm 130. Please join me, it's in your packet, as we start this time of learning together by doing what Jews have always historically done, and so many of us have done since October 7th, in the prayerful form of screaming. You can rise if you're able and if it's your custom to do so. Shir Hamalot Mimamakim Kraticha Adonai. Adonai Shima Bekoli Tianos Necha Kashuvot Lekol Tachanunai. Im Avonot Tishmor Ya Adonai Miyamod. Ki imcha haslicha leman tivarei. Kiviti Adonai kivta nafshi velidvaro hochalti. Nafshi l'Adonai mi shomrim laboker, shomrim laboker. Yachel Yisrael el Adonai, ki im Adonai hachesed veharbe imo fidut. Vehu yiftet Yisrael michol avonotav. I'm not sure that reciting Tehillim is an act of speaking rationally or a rational act. I doubt that many of us, when we do that activity, process all of the theological moves of Psalm 130. I found, maybe because of the routinized way that it operates within prayer, maybe because of the sing-song way in which we recite it, that I don't really actually think about the words. Maybe the word mima amakim, from the depths. Maybe the way that it has become part of our consciousness as Jews enables it to be the language with which we as Jews are inclined to scream out when we are experiencing shock. Elsewhere in the book of Psalms, in Psalm 137, we get the narrative version of this experience. Al Naharot Bavel, Sham Yashavnu v'gam bachinu b'zachrenu at Zion. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat and wept as we remembered Zion. We hung up our lyres, our captors asked us there for songs, our tormentors for amusement. Sing us from the songs of Zion. Eich nashir et shir Adonai al admat nechar. How might we possibly sing the song of God on this foreign soil? The lamentation here is one of absolute shock. So as opposed to the performative act of singing, doing something that would emanate naturally from the heart. The obstacle to singing is the weeping. Actually, in this context, that weeping, that lamenting, betrays the incapacity to actually narrate what happens. That's all we have. The lament and the weep, in contrast to the programmatic singing. I want you to think back to those first moments. For many of us and for many of our people, not just moments, but even months after October 7th, in the ways in which our experience of processing grief and trauma defied explanation. I think powerfully so, importantly so, to remember that prior to processing and narrating and storytelling, which is what we're going to talk about today, there is deep value in acknowledging the humanity of merely responding with lament, with shriek, and with screaming. That instinct to expressions of pain produces expressions of solidarity that need not be narrative and need not be political. I'm struck by the ways in which sometimes in Jewish life, when hard things happen, sometimes people look towards Jewish leaders to explain them right away. We'll talk about that more. Or to do something. And I've noticed that one of the normal habits that we have as Jews is to do things like reciting Tehillim, which maybe, if you've never done it before, or if it's not your habit, feels like the opposite of doing something. But to many of us is exactly what one is supposed to do, to actually bridge the gap between the primal human experience of screaming and the language of doing something offered by tradition as encoded in prayer, in ritual, and in relationship. But at a certain point, it becomes necessary to shift from screaming to something else. From screaming as a primal response to understanding. And one of the ways that we do this as human beings, needless to say as Jews, is through the activity of storytelling. I was introduced to the following scientific study by my friend and colleague, Rabbi Mary Brett Kaplan. Some of you may know, she's a chaplain. And she sent me this scientific study. The thing I like about scientific studies as opposed to anything in the humanities is that scientific studies titles of articles tell you everything that there is in the article. The article suggests storytelling is a unique human skill. This study provides evidence of biomarker changes and beneficial effects of storytelling in children admitted to intensive care units. We found that compared to an active control condition, one storytelling session with hospitalized children leads to an increase in oxytocin, a reduction in cortisol and pain, and positive emotional shifts during a free association task. There are powerful medical benefits to elevate somebody from an experience of pain to an experience of something on the other end that happens through storytelling. What is a companion piece to this is the recognition that screaming and storytelling can't happen at the same time. So at least to know that is to know that there's a certain point where one activity can stop and the second can begin. To begin to storytell, to narrate, to translate, to generate meaning is a means of emergence out of trauma. It's a necessary evolution. It's not only the way to deal with the pain that we've experienced, but also the mechanism by which we prepare for a future that finds a way to integrate the pain into memory, make it into a usable past, and move us into a possible future. It is true medically, and it is true as the core activity that the Jewish people have done with our traumas throughout our history. So what is that story? What is the story that we want to tell following October 7th about our ideas and beliefs and what in fact may have changed in those catastrophic moments? I'm taken with a metaphor offered by Rabbi B'nai Lappi in her Eli talk which is like the Jewish version of a TED Talk, which means fewer people watch it. But a beautiful talk entitled An Unrecognizable Jewish Future, a Queer Talmudic Take. The metaphor that I like that Rabbi Lappy offers is the metaphor of crashing. She argues that all great stories of all great civilizations eventually at one point or another reach a crash. And the challenge for the Jewish leaders of that particular era on any particular time is to decide consciously and unconsciously, but mostly I think through the work of storytelling, what of the past story has to be salvaged, adapted, and modified, and what has to be rejected. Rabbi Lappy argues that there are three and only three possible responses to a crash. Option one, deny anything has changed. Deny the crash has occurred. Revert and hold on to your master story. Hang on for dear life and build walls around that old master story to make sure nothing interferes or threatens it again. Option two, accept that the story has crashed, reject that story completely, and jump off into a completely new story. And of course, we know the third option is the most complicated and probably the most reliable. To accept that the story has crashed, but instead of abandoning that story, you stay in it, reinterpreting it through the lens of the crash, and building a new story from the amalgamation of the original story, the crash material, and the reinterpretation. Rabbi Lappy tells this as the story she uses to process how rabbinic tradition integrated the destruction of the temple into the reimagination of Judaism in antiquity. I want us to use this frame, the crash of a big story, to process the events of the past 9.5 months. There are so many areas where truths I believed or dogmas that I held to over the first 46 and a half years of my life felt either debunked, challenged, or at least ripe for reimagination or re-examination. It's hard generally to say I was totally wrong about something. It's hard if you've made a career around the reliability of people listening to you. And it's critical for all of us in our work to be able to notice that there are aspects of our master story as a community that have held for a few generations that crashed, that feeling of October 7th was not merely trauma and pain of the actual events of that day, but the erosion of the foundations upon which many of us feel that we stand. I think I'm not alone in listing mine. I'm going to ask you in Chavruta to consider what else I missed that may have been yours. I think for many of us in the Jewish people, one of those crashes is around a basic sense of safety. Now, any serious Jew knows that Jews are not really ever safe. You know something about Jewish history, our political realities, anything about the 20th century, you would be naive to believe that the fundamental ontological condition of Jews as safe has never quite emerged. But this Machon has talked for a long time about that story of the Jewish people going from no homes to two homes, the powerful ways in which the whole existential condition of the Jewish people changes in the 20th century, not only in the state of Israel, but also for North American Jews, the embeddedment that we have within as societies in which we can think of ourselves as members, and in some ways the dual guarantee provided by those two stories taking place at the same time in Jewish history that preserves the mutuality of at-homeness in two places, and the kind of basic sense of safety that that offers. And to feel the crashing, both in Israel and in North America, with the kind of rise of a blatant anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism that is sometimes making us uncomfortable, and many times also making us unsafe. I continue to insist that those are not the same thing, right? We don't always have to talk about them as the same thing, but neither is it a smart move to claim that none of these situations actually make us unsafe. That first crash feels very significant. I would argue that for many liberal American Jews, including many who identify as Zionist, another crashing narrative has been around a kind of basic belief in the imminence and possibility of peace. What happens to a people that believes deeply in what it means to be Ohavei Shalom, Virodfei Shalom, lovers of peace and pursuers of peace, to have to wrestle with the possibility that it may not take foot in our lifetime? What happens, by the same token, for those of us who have believed and argued for a long time that many of the challenges that Israel faces largely can be attributed to Israel's responsibility, when we are meant to confront aspects of agency by some sectors of the Palestinian people that simply do not afford the convenience of that explanation of why peace has not come? What happens to the confrontation and crash of that story if a particular story that Jews have talked about as relates to our relationship with Israel and ties to our Jewish values feels it is not in our control? Another big story that so many North American Jews have told me over the past 9.5 months is the crash of the belief that my allies share my values. Not that I don't have allies, but that somehow lost in this process is that what was important to me, what I considered essential to my Jewishness, somehow didn't factor in to what someone else thought was essential to my Jewishness. The confusion I encountered with 25 synagogue executive directors in Westchester in November, who said to us, all of them said, I don't get it. Our neighboring churches showed up after Pittsburgh, but I didn't get a single message after this. And there may be things we have to learn about what we communicate around Jewish peoplehood, but that jarring feeling of, was I taken for a ride? That is a crash of a narrative that needs to be confronted. Doesn't mean that it is not rehabilitatable, savable. I don't think it means for most North American Jews, I'm going to stop caring about racial justice, because most American Jews cared about racial justice independently. It wasn't a favor to our neighbors, but I now have to interrogate what those relationships were about. For Israelis, the language of crashing mostly revolves around the wonderful Hebrew word, the concepsia. That Hebrew word suggesting that there was a way of thinking about strategy and management of Hamas that was going to keep Israelis fundamentally safe for a long time. And it revolved around 3 areas of confidence that Israelis feel shattered today. Confidence in the army, confidence in a strategy of how to manage Hamas based on a belief that they would never be able to execute something as complicated as October 7th. And third, confidence in Netanyahu about his central claim of his leadership, more than anything else, of I can keep you safe. What happens to a society that has been governed politically essentially by the same conceptual regime, and after 20 years of that story, has to confront the possibility that it was never true? But the biggest 2 crashes that I want to spend our time learning about today are, number 1, the belief that Israel fundamentally changed Jewish history. What happens when we really have believed for a long time that Zionism altered the paradigm of Jewish history, moved us from a period of a kind of theological cycle of events, B'chol dor vador, omdim aleinu l'chalotenu, and some of the time, HaKadosh Baruch Hu matzilenu mi'adam, and sometimes we suffer under that omdim aleinu l'chalotenu, but I go through cycles, that way of thinking about Jewish history, that Zionism came along and said, we are done with that story. And then suddenly, on October 7th, the word that so many of us gravitated to help make sense, conceptually of this moment is the word pogrom. What does it mean to the very story that we've told ourselves about Zionism? If the thing we reach towards actually implies a rejection of one of the core elements of Zionism that has been essential to the lives and identity of the Jewish people since 1948. What happens to that crashing of that story? And the second one I want us to deal with today is the belief by liberal Jews and liberal Zionists that the liberal order basically works. That story has been crashing for a while. It was not October 7th alone. I think for many liberal American Jews, I don't know where to start the clock, but certainly January 6th feels like a companion piece to October 7th. Not to compare the two events, but to notice that both of them suggest a kind of erosion of something deep and trustworthy, that liberal societies were not perfect yet, but that we were kind of bending towards that process. That all we needed to do is kind of gently coax those processes of liberalism along, and that they would essentially guarantee our safety and security. October 7th, as we'll talk about a little bit later, rattles us in two ways, both because one of the most powerful illiberal forces that exploits the weaknesses of liberalism is terror. It threatens us through an illiberal attack, and it also threatens us, and this is how terror is so effective, by making us less liberal in response. So if we no longer believe that the liberal order keeps us safe, that has a, what's the word I'm looking for? Rolling downhill effect. Cascading, good, thank you. It has a cascading effect of beginning to open a door that you can't close again. And once you no longer trust in that system, you are then participating with all of these competing forces on the poles of society to hold a society stable. This is what we're going to talk about today. For your chavruta, we have chavruta today, yeah? For your chavruta, I want you to start for a few minutes just confronting a little bit of this question. If you spend more of your time on the crashing and less on the text, that's also okay. It's your first day. What are any other questions and assumptions essential to who you are as a rabbi, as a Jew, that have felt that they have been rattled? On the two issues themselves, I'll just tell you what's here and you can choose your own adventure. On the question of liberalism and the liberal order, I gave you two examples, one from Francis Fukuyama, a Stanford political theorist, an essay from 1989 called The End of History, which is rooted in a belief that liberalism has altered the paradigm and that there are no major threats to the liberal order. And I guess the Israeli Zionist version of this was Shimon Peres's magnificent and in retrospect thought by many Israelis naive speech at the United Nations right around the time of the Oslo signing in 1993, in which he uttered that memorable phrase that became a book, The New Middle East. The belief that we were converging on a new telos for this region. Both Fukuyama himself, at the end of the excerpt that I've given you, but especially Aharon Barak, start introducing what are going to be the possible threats of the liberal order. So I want you to listen for the roots of the problem of the belief in the power of liberalism in that first section. When it comes to the second problem, Zionism changing Jewish history, I want you to first read this last Mishnah in the 9th parak, the last Mishnah in the last parak of Tractate Sota, which describes a kind of theology very consistent to most of diaspora Jewish history, a theology of powerlessness, that Bialik in Ir HaHariga both describes and argues that Zionism has to change. He doesn't argue in the conventional sense, after all it is a poem. But Bialik's poem represents, at the moment of the pogrom, a commitment to try to change the story of Jewish history. That's the argument of Ir HaHariga. That's going to help clarify and deepen these two ideas that we're talking about, these two ruptures and crashes. But in terms of the move I want to make, I want us to zoom out for last section here on the redemption and the cycle of history to consider what does it mean as a Jew to think about the flow of history? Does it continue or does it end? And really the two texts to consider are this well-known sugya from Avodah Zarah, which says over and over, Olam kimin hago noheg, the world follows its natural course. In the Gemara, I want you to listen to the powerlessness that's involved in that text, and I want you to read about how the Rambam fixes that. We're going to try to consider, when we come back, what does it mean to stand at the feet of these challenges of these stories that have crashed, and to try to pick up the pieces and to make sure that we don't lose our own agency in Jewish history simply because we feel that it has been taken away from us. That's what we're going to try to do. Okay? You have until 3 o'clock, and we'll come back together. Spread out. Okay, I asked you to consider the crash of two significant stories, and I want to start with the story of a narrative that the liberal West has described for itself over the last two generations. If you read some of Fukuyama and certainly Perez, both Fukuyama and Perez tell a story of a kind of liberal optimism, not just a belief in the liberal order, and certainly not an argument about the superiority of the liberal order, the West, compared to the alternatives that are available, but a kind of belief in its inevitability. That this has been, in a weird way, it's almost theological, like a flow of history into a particular direction, and now a belief that that flow of history is going to continue largely unimpeded because of the events of their own lifetime. There is a deep hubris that underlies both of these pieces, especially in Fukuyama's characterization of it at the end as the end of history. And if you notice, I think there are two major intellectual trends or ideas that underlie the conviction that by the late 1980s, early 1990s, someone could make an argument about the end of history. The first, most proximate, is the end of the Cold War and the death of the failure of the totalitarian ideological regimes of the 20th century. Reasonable to believe the kind of heady post-Cold War, post-mid-20th century ideological collapse to argue that as those gestures towards totalitarianism fade away, as they emerge off of the global scene, the defeat of those ideological commitments by the liberal West reflects an indefinite defeat. That was the best last gasp of massive ideological alternatives to Western liberalism. But I would even make this go back further. This whole story connects to a larger kind of Enlightenment hubris. The very phrase enlightenment is kind of an amazing phrase, right? Which reflects a moral and intellectual ascent from the Dark Ages. We sit atop history as opposed to seeing ourselves as part of a continuation of history. The Enlightenment, the whole notion of the Dark Ages, of course, misses huge swaths of human civilization that didn't operate according to the narrative of how the West understood its sequence. It leaves out all sorts of intellectual evolutions that take place under Islamic rule, other Eastern civilizations. Nevertheless, a big story of what fuels the moment of the kind of secular messianism that is located in both Fukuyama and Perez is this combination of the inheritance of the narrative of enlightenment and its superiority to what came before, and a particular historical moment in which it would be located. And I can't help but think that when Fukuyama especially uses the terminology of ideology, when he says, what we may be witnessing is not just the end of the Cold War or the passing of a particular period of post-war history, but the end of history as such. So that is the end point of mankind's ideological evolution, and the universalization of Western liberal democracy is the final form of human government. It's hard not to hear that ideology in that sentence could be replaced with the word empire. That's the story that human civilization has lived through, the rise and fall of empires, which is still a story that you can see at the Tower of David Museum. This empire rises and then it falls, and then this empire rises and then it falls. And in a weird way, even in a Zionist narrative, does that mean that this is the latest empire? That story conveys that Fukuyama is trying to argue that that period of human history has been replaced or should be replaced by something else, more as he describes it as a bureaucratic or technocratic order, where we all basically agree on the right form of government and the system by which we should organize our societies, and we can debate, right, the technical ways in which that's supposed to be played out. And it also assumes a kind of universal understanding that everybody knows that the best possible framework to protect all of our rights is to trust in this system. I'll come back to that in a second, because I want to say a word about Peres. Israelis always found Shimon Peres's vision of the new Middle East to be naive, and the real death knell in Israel to Peres's vision of a new Middle East, to talk about it as secular messianism is not a throwaway phrase. The vast majority of the excerpt that I gave you is deeply secular, and then he ends with messianism, an appeal to the language of the prophets. So it is, certainly Peres doesn't believe in the messianic era as imagined in the prophets, but it is messianic in both the vocabulary that he uses and also the telos of this secular order. So Israelis, the death knell really of this type of liberal messianism in Israel was the Second Intifada, right? As it eroded between 1990, the confidence in the possibility of this liberal order in a new Middle East erodes between 1993 and really 2001, 2002. However, I would suggest that this vision or version of a possible Israel has been really important to liberal Jews and liberal Zionists in North America for a long time, well past the end of the Second Intifada. Maybe not that liberal Zionists believe that this is actually the story of what's taking place in Israel, but a belief that we are on that journey and that the liberal order may not be a reality yet, but in some ways a kind of inevitability. Maybe for Americans, this is rooted in a unshakable, unflagging optimism that characterizes the American project, parenthetically, which is flagging. But that's been important to believe all we need to do is X, all we need to solve is Y, and of course, this is the right alignment of vision and values and a form of government and a final status agreement that will ultimately characterize this state, this story of the Jews, resolve our cognitive dissonance between the values of liberal democracy that are essential to our American Jewish identity and to our Zionism, as it represents here. That hope in something, I think, has kept more American Jews, liberal American Jews and liberal Zionists committed to the kind of liberal secular messianism of Shimon Peres. It's no surprise that Peres's death was mourned in Israel, but was a massive tragedy in other parts of the world. Right? Experienced as he's the carrier of this possible Israel that maybe I could still believe we are on the path to achieve. Fundamental problem of liberalism, and it's been the case always, is that for liberal order to work and to hold, we all, or at least the overwhelming majority of the people within a particular society, have to believe in it. But not only that, the overwhelming majority of the members of a liberal society have to work all the time to advance it, cannot rest on the laurels of believing that we're at the end of history. You have to constantly push that rock up a hill, and you have to engage in mitzvot, commitments, to actually sustain it. And you're always pushing against the slippages by those who don't believe in that social order. After a while, if majority, or at least a plurality of people, no longer subscribe to the liberal commitments, then a position that even may feel like it is the majority position will start to feel like a minority position. Which is a decent way of characterizing the current state of mind of many liberal Zionists in the North American Jewish community who still represent the majority of American Jews, but who feel like a beleaguered minority. That's a strange reality. A good example is the challenge that pluralistic institutions, communities, or even individuals face in the following way. Do pluralists have to be pluralistic towards anti-pluralists? And the basic answer is, yeah. You have to stretch yourself to include those who don't believe in the core values of your society until, there's a big until you experience that those anti-pluralists are actually destroying the environment for others. But that means I'm constantly, in order to maintain and build a liberal order, I'm constantly stretching, right, towards inclusiveness of a whole bunch of people in ways that they don't feel constrained by in terms of how they act towards you. This is a problem that liberal societies have always faced. If all of us basically believe that this is the best way for us to live, then we yield a little bit. You want to have a society of real difference, you have to only be passionate to a certain extent because you want to create the possibility for the presence of others. And as we know, anti-liberals are more passionate, because the passion for building societies of equality and pluralism and belonging is very different than building societies that are governed by very clear ideological commitments that brook no difference. Now, both Fukuyama, if you noticed in the second half of the excerpt, is aware that there are two possible threats to the liberal order. I found this, when I read this again, I found it hilarious. Because Fukuyama says there are two possible threats on the horizon for the liberal order, but don't worry, we will be able to handle them. And the two are religion and nationalism. And I read this, I was like, he was right. These are the two possible threats to the liberal order, both of which are wedded to a kind of, almost by definition, commitment to ideological passion that brooks no compromise. Avishai Margalit talks about the difference between religion and politics, and by definition, something that is what he calls in the grip of the political lends itself to compromise. It is a secular commitment. Politics, to quote Bismarck, the art of the possible. I'm going to try to get as much as I can, but I know that for the system to hold, I'm going to be constantly negotiating to get the best that I can relative to someone else. Whereas religion, Margalit says, is in the grip of the holy. And that which is holy, right, if you compromise in the holy, you compromise that which is holy. Religious claims are totalizing. So the challenge that you can hear baked into the story of liberal optimism is the belief that we are going to be able to get above the way that religion thinks about conviction and commitment, because all of us are going to want to suspend our passions in order to belong to something, almost unwilling to confront the possibility that religion will make totalizing claims that refuse to participate in the liberal order. Meanwhile, nationalism, I don't have to tell you, the more that deep nationalism arises in this society, it becomes uncompromising about the borders and citizenship and security of this state. And we have to confront the possibility that there is another violent nationalism that exists between the river and the sea, which is equally, if not more, uncompromising. If you noticed, if you read Barak does a beautiful job expressing, and notice the year, 2001, right around the time of 9/11, right around the time of the Second Intifada. These two global events that only a decade after the end of history begin to erode the foundations of the possibility of the end of history. And for those who are interested, by the way, there are countless articles called The End of History, and countless responses by Fukuyama, it is not the end of history. But 9/11 and the Second Intifada emerge essentially at the same time, and Barak has a beautiful articulation of the fundamental problem that liberal democracies face when they confront terror. As he says on page 8, in present times, democracy faces the emergent threat of terrorism. Passive democracy, which, as I described, the less passionate version of how we argue for our liberal order, is transformed into defensive democracy. All of us are concerned that not become uncontrollable democracy. As judges, we are aware of the tension between the need to protect the state and the right of the individual. And his first argument is human rights are not indefinite. You can't actually allow for total freedom of human and civil rights. Therefore, he says in the middle of the next paragraph, limitations on human rights reflect a national compromise between the needs of the state and the rights of the individual. In the words of Barak, it's elegant and eloquent. In both American society and Israeli society, that tension winds up playing out in policies and attitudes towards individual rights and national rights that are deeply endangering. It was recently, in the last number of years, that my Palestinian colleagues, I've always taught this as a powerful way of even expressing the dance between the universal and the particular. It's like a powerful companion to all of the texts we study in our tradition about the individual, the community, and the society. And I love the way that it elevates those ideas into modern Israeli jurisprudence. And in recent years, my Palestinian colleagues have said this is the beginning of the end of Palestinian civil rights. The minute that we acknowledge publicly, for citizens of Israel, the minute we acknowledge publicly that we have to navigate between the human and civil rights that we give to some of our people and the needs of the state, even though that tension is always there, the minute we articulate it publicly, then even the liberal advocates for human rights and civil rights have opened the door to a version of stripping away those human rights and civil rights that minorities depend on. Since the early 2000s, we have seen how religion, nationalism, and compromises on human rights and civil rights have been threatened, and the rise of these stories start to confirm the narratives of all of those who aren't in this Beit Midrash expressing uncertainty, but who are actually quite certain of themselves. October 7th confirms the narrative of the far right in Israel. It confirms the narrative about existential threats connected to the very identity of the Palestinian people. That story, I tell you, Ben Gvir is not walking around saying, what I believed before, I no longer believe. Ben Gvir walks around and says, I told you so. And it is also confirming the narratives of the global left, which is persuaded that the dance that the state of Israel has been trying to do between, as an attempt to build a liberal democracy, lo haya velo nivra, as they say. It was never viable, it was never possible. It is unmaking it as a lie. Also, it's not coincidence that on October 8th and October 9th in the West, the emergence of the anti-Israel left was not one rooted in screaming and in lack of confidence in their narratives, but in an affirmation that their version of a story, resistance of the legitimacy of Palestinian resistance by any means necessary, and the vision to dismantle what's taking place here and replace it with something else, was for them affirmed in a moment like this. The first crash I want us to consider is, what do liberals, those who believe in liberal democracy, and in particular the Jewish case of liberal Zionism, do when it appears as though that consensus no longer holds, when you start to subscribe to the possibility that maybe this was too optimistic all along, and when you start to notice that on both extremes, those forces are traveling with wind in their sails as opposed to swimming against the currents. The second challenge I asked you to think about is the question of whether Zionism was meant to end Jewish history or at least transform it, and to listen to the way that that was such an essential feature of the emergence of Zionism in the 20th century, to hearken to the language and the experience, the reawakening of Jewish epigenetic trauma over the past 9 months, which starts to rattle the foundations of the belief that something was supposed to have changed. In the Mishnah, in Sota, as I said, it's the last Mishnah and the last parak, and there's a reason for this. Tractate Sota is one of those tractates of Mishnah where it's hard for the rabbis to hide, as they do in the rest of the Mishnah, that the temple no longer exists. You could read this is a great debate by scholars, is the Mishnah trying to pretend that the Beit HaMikdash is still standing? Or is the whole construct of the Mishnah a post-traumatic response rooted in knowledge that the Beit HaMikdash is not standing? And what's the answer? Actually, it's who knows? Right? Those are good reading strategies of the Mishnah, but there's no possible way, because the Mishnah, unlike books, doesn't tell you what it's doing. It starts mid-sentence with Tractate Brachot, and it ends as though the ending of a human religious life is with laws of ritual purity and sanctification of sacrifices. Mishnah Sota is one of those places where there's a little bit of a crack, and it starts to emerge near the end of the tractate. Because everybody knows that the Sota ritual is something that can't exist afterwards. And even earlier in the 9th parak of Mishnah Sota, it starts with a curious admission. I didn't give it to you here, but I'll walk you through it. Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai intentionally ceased, that is, while the temple was standing, intentionally ceased the ritual of the Sota. And not in so many words, it's because people didn't believe in it anymore. So the dignity of God and the temple was being eroded by the fact that if people don't believe in the magical ritual taking place, nobody's going to trust it anymore. And this opens up a long cascade of what ultimately appears to be a kind of sermon at the end of this tractate about all the ways that Judaism got worse after the destruction of the temple. We know this in traditional vocabulary as the idea of Yeridat Hadorot. And this is one of our first indicators of this as an axiom of the rabbinic tradition. It was better, and now it's worse. And there are, if you read the whole chapter, you have 15 Mishnayot talking about how many things were better in someone else's age. When Rabbi Akiva died, the glory of the Torah ceased. That's not good. When Rabbi Chanina ben Dosa died, there were no more people of good deeds. Also not good. The pious ceased. It's getting worse and worse. But then there's this amazing refrain that begins to emerge, which makes it sound almost like a call and response type of sermon, almost like a poem or a song, which is this phrase at the end of the second paragraph. I want to make sure I get it right. Al mi lanu lehishain al avinu shebashamayim. What can we rely on anymore? And I guess the message is, as opposed to our own skills and ingenuity, as opposed to our own capacity to write the narrative of Jewish history, what is left for us is a religious posture of powerlessness. All that's left for us is to rely al avinu shebashamayim. I noticed there was a very popular song here in Israel, Ein lanu ami lehishaen ela al avinu shebashamayim. I mentioned to my colleagues once that it seemed interesting to me that it emerged after the Second Intifada, and they didn't like that theory. But I think I was right. I think that theological language that says, it's not really in our hands, we're not going to fix this problem. Instead of that, we're going to appeal to a language of faith, what is a post-traumatic decision that is deep in the Second Temple story in Jewish history. The problem is that Zionism looked at that and said, no, we're not interested in that story anymore. One of the central conceits of Zionism, and the reason it became successful, was precisely the refusal to say we rely on God, instead the insistence that we rely on ourselves. David Hartman writes about this in Israelis and the Jewish Tradition, that Zionism was sought to demythologize the Jewish people's story about itself. What am I supposed to do? I want to change Jewish history. It's not pray, it's relocate, it's learn agriculture, learn the mechanisms of building a civil society, build an army, do that weird thing that produces a Jewish state unimaginable in most eras in Jewish history, which would have a great army and terrible school system. That's a change in a fundamental concept of what's the priority as a Jew, right? I'm going to reject all of those elements that reflect a commitment to powerlessness and replace it with a totally new story. I think one of the anchor texts which tells you that this is what Zionism seeks to do is the vicious set of sentences in the second paragraph of the excerpt that I gave you from Bialik. The poem written after the Kishinev pogrom, one of the most significant pogroms that alters the commitment of Jews worldwide to start believing that there must be an alternative to persecution. Parenthetically, everybody knows this now, Kishinev, which was an analogy to pogrom used by many people after October 7th, 48 people were killed. So think about a pogrom that changes Jewish history. Kishinev is the one, and it doesn't compare. Bialik, however, I think the most vicious area of this, and you can follow in the English or in the Hebrew, is describing the men watching as their families were killed and as their women were defiled. And Bialik says, how did their men bear it? How did they bear this yoke? What did they do when they were persecuted like this? They crawled out of their holes. They fled to the house of God. They offered thanks to God, right? They went to the rabbi's house and asked a halachic question. Is my wife permitted to me again? More vicious is the next paragraph, where he says, I'm going to let go and I'll bring you to those who were hiding, right? Batei macharaot, right? The privies, the pig pens, where the heirs of Hasmoneans laid, place where they hide. He says, concealed and cowering the sons of the Maccabees. Look at what Jews do. When persecuted, they ask either an appeal to the theological, an appeal to the halachic, right? Or, more damningly, hiding and cowering that people that has completely forgotten its identity and its destiny of being the children of the Maccabees. There's divine hiddenness in Bialik as well. He mentions that the Jewish people are at the mercy of the family of nations, right? He says that's what you need to do is conjure the sympathy of other peoples, right? And there is a little bit of a charge at the end. Bialik's poem, a devastating depiction of Jewish trauma, is also a not particularly well encoded charge to change Jewish history. We don't want it anymore. And at the same time, I felt this too. I even wrote about it. October 7th reawakens the epigenetic trauma that Bialik is describing without the judgment. If you have traveled to Kfar Aza and to Nir Oz, and some of you have, and some of you are going to go next week, it's not crazy to walk through Kfar Aza and Nir Oz and feel that you are breathing something that Bialik had best explained 100 years ago, right? This, however, to describe ourselves as a pogrom, I think would embarrass Bialik, because the fundamental difference between then and now is that there was no day after for the Jews of Kishinev but to pick up the pieces, whereas the State of Israel had October 7th and has October 8th. It embarrasses many Israelis to even think about the ways in which they retreated to that sense of vulnerability and victimhood when the main fix that Zionism introduced to the Jewish people was not actually you will never be vulnerable again, but that you will actually have the capacity to fight back. You will refuse to allow for the telos of victimhood to be indefinite vulnerability. But these narratives are returning, and we're going to be talking about them all week. Tal is going to teach on the notion of Am levadad yishkon, a people that dwells apart, which has been a big story for Zionism since October 7th, this question of we thought we were correcting the story of our alienation of the family of nations, and now we feel once again existentially alone. I talked about the metaphors of catastrophe, and even that phrase, that ubiquitous phrase, the most Jewish deaths in one day since the Shoah, which feels like an effort to reconnect the dots of this story to Jewish history uninterrupted, the way that Abba Kovner does. I gave this to you because Kovner is famous for having popularized in the 1940s, we went like sheep to the slaughter, which he was oftentimes criticized for because it sounded like a critique of the Jews themselves for simply submitting to the Nazis. And Kovner says, none of you seem to have read anything about Jewish history. I didn't make up this phrase. This is an indictment of God, not of the victims. God, because who's the shepherd? So God is the one who has let his sheep go to the slaughter. What Kovner is trying to do, which Zionism is trying to do, is to say that has been the 2,000-year story of our people, and we refuse to allow that to be the continuing story to today. The very resignedness about this is a bad neighborhood, and this is the way it is going to be, implies a certain story of powerlessness. And in North America, the constancy with which you hear North American Jews talking about the inevitability of a return to pre-modern diasporic conditions, the basic vulnerability of what's going to happen following the election, maybe we're reverting to the mean. Maybe we should look for our passports in our suitcases, although parenthetically, very few people are doing that. We're talking about it, but it's not clear that we're doing it. But that psychological move, that condition, suggests or betrays a yielding to a previous era of Jewish history that many of us had thought had gone away. I want us to consider that one way to think about this in classical textual terms is a view of history that appears in the Gemara that I think Maimonides tries to fix. It will not surprise any of you who have been here for a while that Maimonides might offer the answer in the Hartman Beit Midrash. The Gemara on Avodah Zarah uses this amazing phrase, the phrase "Olam kemin hago noheg." The context that the Gemara offers is a confrontation between the rabbis, the sages, and philosophers in Rome. One thing, by the way, to notice, even in this text, is that this is a confrontation that appears not to be characterized by fear. We're actually living in a free society, and we can have conversations between rabbis and philosophers, between our sages and their sages, which is not like, Nachmanides and his debate with Pablo Cristiani, where if you lose, you're going to get booted. The stakes feel different. And even so, even in the context of the stakes feeling different, the rabbis appeal to a kind of theology, a strange kind of confident theology of powerlessness, a kind of acceptance of fate, of being stuck in a particular cycle. The first teaching is a little bit more banal for our purposes. The philosophers asked the sages in Rome, if your God doesn't want people to do idol worship, why does God let the sun, the moon, and the stars persist? That's an easy win. right? Well, if God destroyed all of the objects of idol worship, you'd have to destroy human civilization. Fine, that's not a great argument, but it gets stronger. The rabbi's argument gets stronger and more subtle politically. Okay, fine, but what about a person who commits a transgression and nevertheless things work out for that person? Basic question of theodicy. Why does God allow it that people can steal a se'ah of wheat, plant it, and it still grows? A person who engages in adulterous intercourse should not become pregnant, but the world goes along. Olam kimin hagon oheg. We don't make claims that we can actually radically change the course of human history. Let God figure that out later. Right? Atidin litain shotim shekalkalu atidin litain etadin. Eventually, there will be some transformation of the natural order, where this problem will get fixed. But until there is a transformation of the natural order, it's not ours to reason why, to question why the world operates the way it operates. We are effectively stuck in this cycle, and you hear the anger or the sadness expressed by Reish Lakish near the end of this Gemara, who says it's worse than you think, because God is also powerless in this story. God says, it is not enough for the wicked that they treat my Sela coin, that is to say, the human being created in my image, the way that other emperors mint coins in their image, God mints humans in God's image. It's not just that they treat their bodies as though they are ownerless, right? They also cause me to place my image of God on their offspring. They do whatever they want with their bodies, but I, God, am forced to treat every human being that's born as also created in the divine image. It's not just we who are powerless, it's actually God who feels powerless. This is kind of a theological and political acceptance of a story of fate which makes for a kind of revolutionary theory of history. I don't mean revolutionary in there's a revolution. I mean revolutionary in the sense that it goes in cycles. We win, then we lose, then we win, and then we lose, right? That system, which is totally different than and then eventually there's going to be some transformation of the natural order which will convey that we are on the other side of it. Now theologically, there's something very appealing to me about Olam Kamin Hago Noheg. I prefer to worship a non-intervening God. That's just me. But politically, there's something really dangerous about this idea of God not intervening, and in some ways, the demand that human beings also not really intervene in cycles of history that we can't change. That acceptance of the simple cycles of history is, again, a retreat to a pre-modern condition of the acceptance of the cycle of the world. The Rambam, I think, starts to offer us a beginning of a way through. And it's the main idea I want us to consider in response to this turbulent moment between the optimism and responsibility pre-October 7th and the way in which we feel thrown back into Jewish history afterwards. Rambam does something remarkable, which is to take Olam Kamin Hago Noheg and actually locate it not in the framework of an acceptance of human powerlessness, but as an investment in a way of thinking about human responsibility. The Rambam surely knows that the Gemara he's working with means something opposite than to what he's going to argue. But I think it is an amazing play to try to locate ourselves both in a sense of some amount of powerlessness, lest we fall into the hubris of the end of history, and to remind ourselves that the work remains ongoing. Nothing is going to change in the world's nature in the Messianic era. Don't believe that there is some big gap between this cyclical world of history in which we live and some secular or religious Messianic era on the other end, which is a total transformation. O sheyeh shum chidush b'maaseh bereshit. Nothing about the way the world has been created will change. Ela olam kimin hago noheg. Things are going to continue according to their pattern. That which it says in Isaiah, the wool will dwell with the lamb, the leopard will lie down with the young goat. Parables and metaphors. The interpretation of the prophecy as follows: Israel will dwell securely together with the wicked Gentiles, who are likened to a wolf and leopard, as in the prophecy Jeremiah, and so forth, right? They will all these relationships will get sorted out. Similarly, other messianic prophecies of this nature are metaphors. In the messianic era, not only are these going to come true, but everyone's going to know they were metaphors. Right? Because if you're always waiting for a transformation of the natural order, if you're waiting for something different, you will always feel that the messianic era has never been reached, and you will be disincentivized from the slow and banal work of building towards the messianic era, because actually it's God's responsibility to change the cycle of history. You might think that your job is to wait around for the sun to stop in the sky, or for the actual wolf to lie down with the actual lamb, but it's not supposed to be. Maimonides' messianism provides a messianic vision which does not require the radical overhaul of the known world. It's a radical text, but it's also political in nature. I included Maimonides' principle of faith to argue that it's not that Maimonides, by saying the world doesn't transform, is saying, therefore, messianism is irrelevant. He's actually saying it's a principle of faith. But if you believe that it's a principle of faith that it's going to happen, and you believe that it doesn't require a transformation of the world order, you are only left with one option, which is to work every slow day to bring it about. That the transformation of our world order is not supposed to be, as pre-modern Jews might have thought, radical and overnight, depending on Avinu Shebashamayim. The transformation of the world that we know is asymptotic, right? Approaching the limit. For most of our time in Jewish history, never quite getting there. And maybe, finally, there will be a capstone moment when we realize we have reached the place we are supposed to reach. I guess what this means is that how the Jewish people lead towards our messianic era, or, by analogy, how we as Jews build towards that very liberal Zionist world order that matters to us, is supposed to be very boring. Right? Wouldn't it be fun if you actually saw the wolf lie down with the lamb? That would be cool. Wouldn't it be cool if you could witness the transformation of history that the Gemara seems to imply of when the wicked will be dealt their consequences? But what if the work of bridging between the here and the there is boring and straightforward? And here, I deeply feel that the only way towards that liberal order, the only way to escape the problems of Jewish history, the way Bialik wanted us to, is through building that world slowly, patiently, and constantly. Not by demanding the kind of transformations or witnesses to those transformations that are in some of the other texts or political ideologies, nor giving up on it when it confronts obstacles. This is B'nai Lappi's third model. It's not abandoning what you think is the right way to order the world, right? Throwing it out because I'm confronted by something that creates a cognitive dissonance between the world that I want and the world that I have. But it requires us to integrate those obstacles, to be smarter and more intelligent about the limitations of that which we believe. Less hubris, less naivete, integrating that into a vision for the world. There's no way around the moment but through. As I said before, extremists and pessimists about the Jewish future felt vindicated by October 7th. Optimists and moderates do something annoying and awful. This was a great thing written a few years ago after one of the American elections. I'll let you guess which one, where our colleague Rabbi David Rosen in New York, I think he works at Hebrew Free Loan, wrote just a beautiful little meditation, which he said, As bad as anybody might be feeling, the people who will change the world woke up this morning, dusted themselves off, and got back to work. And that helped me. If you accept at a moment like this that the convictions and commitments that we held to were so fundamentally wrong, they just give fuel to those extremists and pessimists. Gershom Shalom illustrates one of the deepest paradoxes within Zionism, which is, was Zionism supposed to be about continuity of Jewish history and rebellion against Jewish history? And like I said about the Mishnah, which one is right? In this case, both. Zionism does have elements of a continuation of Jewish history. Certainly many Zionists believed that we were moving towards the promised land, like we've been trying to do that for a long time. This is the continuation of Jewish history. And he also acknowledges that the revolt against Jewish history is baked in as well. A sophisticated Zionism would actually be able to notice the force of both of those trends. Sophisticated Zionism would feel less rupture by the experience of moments that feel like a continuation of Jewish history, and less rupture when you experience moments that feel like a revolt against Jewish history. A sophisticated Zionism would say the way to reduce the cognitive dissonance between these trends is to be reminded of these as dual forces that represent part of our history. And Shalom insists that the movement is not or cannot be messianic in the classical, traditional, transformative way in which it is thought. The minute you start dancing with the transformation of the world order, you invite a politics that will be a fulfillment of that prophecy, to the great danger and detriment of the story of the Jewish people. The last text I want to consider together with you, which I didn't ask you to read, but maybe some of you did, which is fine, is this remarkable little line in the Mechilta to Rabbi Yishmael. The rabbis are talking about what are the merits that led to the exodus from Egypt. I find this to be one of the great chutzpahdik midrashim of all time. Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah says, what was the merit for the exodus from Egypt? B'zchut Avram Avinu. We know that story. Because of the merit of our ancestors, we merited the exodus from Egypt to the promised land. Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai Omer, B'zchut Hamilah, the merit of circumcision, or maybe more broadly, the fact that the Jewish people adhere to our side of the covenant, God rewards that. I get that theologically also, right? The covenant has two parts. Rabbi Omer Bizrizut, right? With zeal, the Israelites left. But then Rabbi goes further. Davar acher, Bizrizut atzman, Yatzu Israel mimitzrayim. Right? It wasn't on the merits of God accelerating us out. It's that we got our act together. How amazing that the rabbis make a kind of counter-argument to the theological merit arguments by saying, we picked ourselves up by our bootstraps and decided to leave. And the merit of our own getting our act together was the process by which we left Egypt and emerged to the wilderness. Now, in that story, even in the story of Exodus itself, we like to think that the story of the Exodus was the story of the emergence of the Israelites from bondage to the promised land. It's not. The story of the Exodus, the heroic story of our people, is the emergence of our people from bondage to the wilderness. The Torah ends that way every year. You know that in the sequel, you get into the promised land, but the essential religious story of our people is to at least figure out how we move ourselves from a place of despair to a place of possibility. The essential story of our people is not how do I move from despair to the resolution. That you got to really work hard at. I think the Mechilta offers at least the first step. Get your act together. Get your act together, and that will be the mechanism to move into the wilderness. As rabbis and as leaders, all of us are confronted regularly to confront All of us are asked regularly to confront the complexity of the world that we face, traumas like the ones after October 7th, because it was not one, it was many. We are often asked to confront complexity of the world with clarity. It's fair that they ask. It's actually, in many ways, our job, right? To be teachers of Torah, wise interpreters, bridges for people who are confused and suffering and hurting to help understand what is going to be different as a result. And at the same time, I want to suggest that an essential part of our responsibility as rabbis and as leaders is to also represent in those moments a Torah that people are seeking that represents complexity. So it is not, I am asking you a hard question, can you give me clarity? It is, I am asking you a hard question, can you give me back a Torah that does not require me to double down on my earlier commitments, nor a Torah that allows me to reject my earlier commitments, but a Torah that enables me to hold that place, that impossible place of something has to change, something has to give, and I need something that will enable me to move forward. I suggested before that the people who interest me least right now in the world are those who are strutting right now because they feel affirmed about the certainty of their narratives. The Gemara in Brachot has an incredible line of a teaching about Moshe, which concludes with, it's a question about how Moshe responds to a particular question, and Moshe in the Torah says, when are they leaving? And he says, kechatzot. And that's like, the rabbis love things like that. It's so suggestive. Why kechatzot and not chatzot? You got to straighten. Does he not know? Did the Torah not already tell us that it's going to happen at chatzot? Why does Moshe say kechatzot in that moment he's being asked? And the Gemara's answer is, teach your mouth. Moshe embodied the teaching, teach your mouth to say, I don't know. Hedge your bets a little bit. There's good strategy to that. If you hedge your bets a little bit, you don't get caught when you make a mistake sometimes. But it's bigger than that. It's a posture of a moral presence in the world that still believes that the Exodus is going to happen at midnight, but uses the phrase around midnight to allow to not get trapped by the Khartoumim, who may have a different clock, but also to model something as a virtue ethics of what it means to teach Torah in a moment of anxiety. We are going to need to lead the Jewish people with as much passion as those who are strutting. I invite you in this Beit Midrash to feel anxious and vulnerable. That's okay. But we are going to have to walk out of this Beit Midrash finding ways to lead with as much passion as those who feel affirmed in their own beliefs after October 7th. And I want you to imagine a world in which moments like this, when rabbis and communal leaders are asked, how do we pick up all the pieces of what we believed before and continue to fight for them? How do we do this? And imagine a world in which we feel capable of answering, I don't know, but let's do it together. Thank you. Who has the microphone? Somebody has a microphone? Great.
Hi, I'm Sammy Barth. A question on paradigm busting. The problem I have with the analogy of pogrom isn't the reflection on what to do the day after, which has variable answers. The issue is the day before. For the pogroms of a different century, a different time, there was nothing else that could possibly have been done. It was, a tragedy almost inevitable at its time. If you stick to the view of Olam Kamin Hagon Oheg, and that Israel is a state with defensive forces, with intelligence, it wasn't a necessity, it was a mistake. It was an abnegation of certain responsibilities, there were certain failures, and that also is intrinsic to the natural functioning of a human structure.
So Another way that asking that question is that word now, the infamous word context. So therefore, using the phrase pogrom implies, right, that Jews are and were powerlessness, that this merely arose against us, Esav sonel Yaakov. This is simply the condition of the world, and there's nothing about Israeli policy for the past 18 years since the disengagement that could have been different, that would have led to a different conclusion. So I think you're right. By the way, I think part of the dynamic that we struggle with in our communities is the question of when can you have which conversation, and the fact that sometimes, for some people, raising that when you want to talk about it runs against the visceral pain that someone else is having that makes them feel as though your desire to talk about Israel's policy towards Hamas is making them feel a sense of being blamed, right, for their own vulnerability and victimhood. So you are right. To complicate the story of pogrom is not just October 8th, but October 6th. That is also a piece of what Zionism challenges in terms of our historical narrative. How I would just push back and say, there is a piece of October 7th, in terms of the crashes, that has also invited those of us, and I can just say it's me, not you, maybe if you want to identify with this, you can, who have really tried to resist the narrative that there is some truth to Esav sonel Yaakov, who really don't want to confront that, right? Who have not wanted to deal with it. I only overlapped in this institution with David Hartman for 3 years before he passed away. But those of you who learned with David know that he simply did not want to talk about the Shoah because he feared what you're talking about, which is talking about the Shoah all the time inculcates the Jewish people with a sense of constant vulnerability, which is a moral get-out-of-jail-free card for anything that we want to do. It characterizes probably his most important and well-known essay, Auschwitz or Sinai. Which of these stories do I want to use as an anchor of the Jewish condition? And yet, Hartman did ultimately concede. I believe it was at his 80th birthday celebration with many of his Talmidim. I didn't take it seriously enough, the Shoah. I didn't want to look down that corridor. Because when you look down that, because it's precisely, you know why you don't want to look down that corridor. I'm nervous that it's going to take away all of our moral agency. So I would say, I think you're right to complicate the picture. It's not merely how an appeal to pogrom ignores October 8th and our agency to respond. It also can ignore October 6th. And I think there's some amount of why the appeal to pogrom actually matters is because there's a piece of it that tells a story of the Jewish condition that we struggle to understand otherwise.
Yes, I had a question about the liberal order. So I just wanted to get a little clarification on exactly what you meant by that. I'm assuming you mean human rights order. It's a concept that it can be very complicated, could be involving a lot of different ideas. So I wonder if you could just sort of put the nukud on that a little bit more.
Sure. I think I mean two things. One is that the basic assumption that the world that we live in is characterized by or defined by a commitment to liberal principles, right? That's the kind of tautological argument. The more explicit argument is a less messianic version of Fukuyama's, which is, this is the obvious best way to organize society is through commitment politically to liberal democracy, right? That is to say, a nation state is the best mechanism by which to preserve the rights, the dignity, the autonomy of an individual. This is obviously the best system, and that by and large, the majority of us subscribe to an essential set of moral principles, which include the right of autonomy until it reaches the right of my autonomy until it reaches the bridge of your nose, right? And I want to build societies that license people to be able to act like that validate the legitimacy of human beings, that create positive tensions within society when we're arguing about important things, but we limit that tension from actually turning into internecine violence. The religion and nationalism cocktail does not subscribe to that ideal vision for a society. If you listen to last week's episode of Identity Crisis with Mati Friedman, which was hard, we argued this exact point. I was arguing with Mati about the vision for Israel to be a liberal democracy in this region, and he is expressing a mounting skepticism of the possibility of being a viable liberal democracy in a region with forces like Hezbollah who simply don't believe in that. It's not just they don't believe in the Jews having a state. It's they don't believe that this is how societies should be ordered and organized, right? And then what happens in turn is that, as Mati pointed out, it's not a coincidence to see images now of Ben Gvir and his goons driving around on the back of Jeeps with machine guns, which visually mirrors what Hezbollah does and Daesh does and ISIS does, because it's a larger embrace of a totally different political and moral theory for how society should be organized. So that's what's happening there, right? It's clearly also happened on the progressive left, which does not actually increasingly use the terminology of liberal democracy and liberal society, increasingly argues that the arguments that liberal societies make about their fundamental legitimacy is premised on lies, and tends to use terminology more like a commitment to justice than a commitment to liberal democracy in an interest of remaking our societies to look like something different. And the fact that that too is burgeoning post-October 7th, post-January 6th, post the Trump election, reflects that these, as is always the case, is the kind of a horseshoe theory of a rejection of the core societal narrative that considers itself to be important. Go ahead.
Hi. I may be getting into the textual weeds, but I'm a Talmud professor.
Go for it.
Our group actually kind of focused on section 4 in the packet. And while I think you've presented a really interesting and plausible reading of these texts, I think ours was a little different. I'd just like to share it and get your thoughts. So first of all, when we were reading Avodah Zarah, I think for us, reading "The world follows its course" and "the fools who sin will be held to judgment in the future" was also a comment about free will. And not just, kind of passive acceptance. It's maybe potentially a strong statement about the role of free will in the world. And then when we were reading Maimonides, I just had this one thought. Israel will dwell securely together with the wicked Gentiles. Right? And he says that's what the wolf and lamb. And it feels to me like, right, I get your idea of we slowly work towards messianism, but there are other people out there who are also claiming that they are working towards messianism, and they're working towards a messianism that allows us to dwell with the wicked Gentiles. Right? And I'm thinking about sort of this, Reshit Smicha Geulatenu, having a state in and of itself where we can deal with the wicked Gentiles becomes messianism. And that feels like something very dangerous, potentially, in Maimonides, and not necessarily Maimonides as the answer.
Yeah.
So I'd just love to hear your thoughts on that.
Great. So I totally accept the kind of elu ve'elu possible emphases on the Gemara and Avodah Zarah. I actually know that as teaching this, I'm doing it in opposite ways that Lauren usually has taught this text, which aligns more with your reading. I feel like I have an antenna out in reading the Talmud for the kinds of descriptions of a fatalistic understanding of the world. And that's why my reading that is pushing against that is trying to do a reading that strips itself of Maimonides. Because I think Maimonides gets closer to a kind of prosaic understanding of the world. But what if you actually removed that and then left this as a political understanding of what it means to live in the world? That's why I come to that conclusion. In terms of your reading of Rambam, I think you are right to say something else has to be happening in the world to lead to this place where not only do we lie down with them, but they lie down with us, right? For Soloveitchik, that is why one of the knocks of history that he uses as an understanding, a political understanding of kol dodi dofek, knocking on the doors of history, is the example that, one of the examples he cites is the embrace by the international community in 1947, 1948 as a willingness to include us in the family of nations. That's what translates into that particular form of religious Zionist messianism. But an equally interesting angle through which to think about this, and really you should ask this of Tal, is that there's also a theory about this war that it emerges precisely at a moment when there is actually a non-secular, non-messianic version of a new Middle East that has been growing over the past 2 decades. That just as Israel is on the verge of normalization agreements with the big prize, which is the Saudis, this is an effort to derail that story and to turn it into something else. And if you are a prosaic, non-theological messianist, it's not hard to read that as a decision by the Umot HaOlam to be also the dialogue partner in the lion lying down with the lamb. And what's powerful about that particular example is nobody would characterize, with the exception, I think, of David Friedman, no one would characterize those normalization agreements as peace. And it would be foolish to characterize them as the triumph of the liberal democratic order, right? It's validating Saudi rule, right? Which is neither liberal nor democratic. But it is a kind of willingness to transact with a version of the world that we have to gradually produce something on the other end. And if you had zoomed back 50 years to say there were going to be normalization agreements between the Israelis and the Saudis, you would have to feel almost messianic as you described it. I don't...
I'm Rafi Spitzer.
Oh, hi.
And I appreciated Bialik's critique of powerlessness and your tension with it. This Pesach, I found the language of the Haggadah, which you referenced in your opening, to be like so different this year. And like every generation, they're coming to get us. And I wonder if there is a spiritual benefit to a posture of powerlessness in addition to its real dangers. And I wondered if you could talk to the spiritual benefit of powerlessness.
It's beautifully asked. I would say, first of all, let's allow for what you're describing as a kind of awakening of Jewish memory in a deep way, a familiarity between the past and the present. That is okay. Let's allow for that. And actually, when we feel that, to not only say that's okay, but it's kind of like what Jewish education is supposed to do, right? It's supposed to create conditions where the things of the world that we live in remind us in some way of the past. That's Jonathan Foer's beautiful expression of this in Everything is Illuminated, where he says when a Jew confronts a knife, he feels the pinprick, of the blade against Isaac's neck at the binding of Isaac, and he asks, when a Jew encounters a pin, he asks, what does it remember like? That's Jonathan's phrase. That's good. In some ways, that's deep Jewish education. And also, I feel for my children, when they experience something in the liturgy and they feel like they're living in it, right? That closure of the gap between past, present, and future of Jewish history that's like good. We did something good. I may have told this story before, but I was going to say stop me if you heard this before, but don't. I'll just tell it anyway. When my oldest was 3 and in pre-K, he came home one day from school. I picked him up from school. He's sitting in the back seat, in the car seat, and he said, Abba, who are the Jewish people? And I was like, I'm ready. And I said, no, we're the Jewish people. And he burst into tears. And I, then at that point pulled over the car. I said, why are you crying? And he said, I'm a firstborn. They're coming to get me. So my first thought was, why on earth is the pre-K teaching that? Of all the things in Judaism around Pesach time, not that. I comforted him, we talked it through, and secretly, I was like, this worked. Right? To feel viscerally that you are living in the story of the Jewish people is a deep thing. We want that to be the case. I guess in your question, though, you use the word spiritual, and I think what I'm trying to get at is, if you can be really careful about differentiating between the spiritual consequences of feeling yourself part of Jewish history and the political consequences of thinking yourself as part of Jewish history, you'll do great. But most of us really struggle with that. Most of our leaders struggle with that. The fixation with anti-Semitism that wants to see it as the metastasis of a hatred that is inexplicable, that is disconnected entirely from Jewish power and Jewish agency, is mapping a spiritual conviction onto a set of political activities. If you can parse that difference really well, that's great. Maybe, actually, that's part of the work of rabbinic leadership, helping people to feel that they live in the story of Jewish history, while also helping them to understand that living in Jewish history should not be an automatic predictor of our own Jewish behaviors next. I guess the reason to be concerned about it is that on the edges, it is so commonly the case that a spiritual identification with a big story becomes wedded to very concrete political strategies that ultimately strip us of the kind of agency that we're talking about building. I know you're looking at me to call on you, but I'm looking at the microphone people to call on people, so I'll leave it to them. I'm giving you a lot of power, microphone friends.
I just feel that it would be helpful to me, at least, for you to spell out the crash of what we're seeing in America, which is young Jews who no longer see the Jewish state as just or moral.
Yeah.
Because I think for us, that is, it's just been a huge wake-up call, and yeah, I just didn't know why it wasn't on your list.
I got a longer list, but look, let me put the American story in a bigger context before we get specifically to the story of, quote unquote, young Jews. The larger challenge that American liberalism faces can be best kind of exemplified by a major landscape shift in which American liberalism after the Second World War and throughout the Cold War was upheld by American trust in three key institutions of liberal democracy: a belief that government was above partisanship, and especially the Supreme Court, a trust in an independent and honest media, and so far keeping score, and the third, and the biggest one, was a real belief in the university as a hallmark of the liberal order. And on all three fronts, the institutions of liberal democracy are really struggling. Now, part of the reason they have been struggling for a while, as I talked about, is that liberalism as a set of commitments and values stopped fighting for itself. Part of the reason I used Fukuyama as an example is because it was kind of a worldview of, obviously this is the best thing for everybody, and I'm going to look down my nose, as he does, at religion and nationalism as other powerful arguments for conviction and identity, and instead going to say, well, those are just going to fade out. They're not going to be able to compete. And what does it actually look like to advocate for the liberal order? And partisanship is a great example because nobody wants to fight for bipartisanship. Very few people do. People want to win elections. So there's been a conflation of what would the activities that Americans do that serve democracy with what are the activities I want to do that's going to help my party win, which I will then say is equivalent to being better for democracy. So in general, we don't do that anymore, and it should be no surprise that we experience these kind of outcomes. I would suggest that we in the Jewish community did the same thing around liberal Zionism, or Zionism more broadly. We treated it as a default position that is obvious and intuitive to our children and grandchildren, that it would be intuitive because we remember eras of Jewish powerlessness. We remember transformative moments like 1967, or my favorite American example, which is when the beautiful coalescence of the bicentennial and the fireworks and the rescue in Entebbe. Like, you couldn't have scripted that better for American Jews. We remember all of those things, and we have this weird psychological thing where we think that our personal memories, even not narrated, are remembered by other people. Totally doesn't work. So instead of actually also naming, by the way, Judaism has a whole bunch of ideas like the pursuit of justice and righteousness. Zionism is kind of a rebellion against certain Jewish ideas. The commitment to liberal Zionism is going to require you to sit in a deep tension. But here's why that tension is worthwhile. I would say by and large, Jewish education doesn't do that. So it's no surprise to see a generation of Jews come along and say, I've resolved that tension more easily. I chose that which I remember. If you're born after 2001, what do you remember? I remember sitting with an activist who said to me, is it conceivable that there will ever be an Israeli prime minister besides Netanyahu? I said, not only is it conceivable, but based on what I know about the human lifespan, it is likely. But is it reasonable for someone born in 2001 to believe that Israel is equivalent to Prime Minister Netanyahu? Reasonable. So unless you're making a powerful counterclaim, it's not surprising that others come along and say, I just don't see the world the way that you do, and I understand the world that you've built as rooted in a kind of hypocrisy against other Jewish values that have been advanced. Now, all of that is a generous reading, but I really want you to take another piece of the story that's taking place among young Jews in America, which is much less chronicled. The vast majority of young Jews in America, I have no statistics on this, but I'm going to just make this claim because I want it to be true. The vast majority of young Jews in America are not what you see depicted based on highly curated media portrayal of young Jews in America. It doesn't come close. Now, I know that that doesn't work when you have people in this room who are saying, it's not about the majority, it's about my kid. I know that that doesn't work. But as a community, if we're going to talk about communal policy, what has been lost in this story is the perception that the major story among generational change in America is what we might call the crisis, when in fact the major generational story that we may be witnessing is something that JFNA put out a study about called the surge, of a massive influx into Jewish life by a lot of people of all ages and demographics who don't think the way that the curated image depicts them to be. When I showed up in Israel on the week of October 14th, and I was traveling around the country and I was talking to Israelis, one of the weirdest things that happened was a number of Israelis said to me, why are American Jews against us? I was like, what are you talking about? I was like, every synagogue in America is packing duffel bags of socks. We were in the first week of raising over $1 billion in a month, which hasn't happened since basically 1949. There's no question of which side American Jews are on. And the answer was, well, I keep seeing on social media this protest of 100 people who have locked themselves in a classroom. I was like, well, we are basically watching the narrative of our community being taken captive by a version of a story that actually plays better in media that's incentivized by polarization. So we also have to be willing to push back against that perception. And even if you're agitated by this subset of folks have a critique and an indictment, what are we doing as a community in parallel to be absorbing and welcoming a generation of Jews who are saying, I identify with you? And if we don't do both of those at the same time, I think we're missing the plot. I think I have time for a couple more.
Speaking as
yes.
someone who doesn't remember the bicentennial,
Me either.
sense of integrity and all of that, I think for many folks kind of in our generation, our global worldview and our story begins with 9/11. And so in many ways, reading folks like Fukuyama is kind of reading a bygone era, like reading the obituary of someone who passed away. And in many ways, our story, or at least my story, has been one of collapse, a collapse of this optimism and this idealism of folks like Perez and Fukuyama. And I was really struck early on when you were describing how one of the things that was lost, one of the crashes that you experienced, was both the imminence, but especially the possibility of peace. And I was thinking about when we were talking about finding that middle ground between powerlessness and hubris, the difference between feeling like you have the answers to right things versus we don't have the power, or we're going to do what we can do in terms of study, prayer, whatever it may be, and let the world behave as it behaves. And so I'm curious for you, what it means to live in this realm of the impossibility of peace. And for us as a people many people describe our superpower as being hope, and that optimism that it will be better in the end, or that peace will be eventually possible. How do we live? How do we inspire when we're kind of in this place where peace does not feel possible, or certainly not imminent?
I guess what I'm teasing at a little bit is the difference between optimism and work, right? Those are not antonyms, right? But they oftentimes feel like they are antonyms, right? Where optimism conveys the belief that things will get better, which for many of us psychologically feels important. And by the way, in the history of human civilization might be true. This is Steven Pinker's argument. Like, we experience setbacks very acutely because of our attunement to the world. We know about every terrible incident happening in the world. But if you zoomed out from the perspective of history, you would say, yeah, human civilization has gotten better. Humans, over 10-year periods and 100-year periods, life expectancy grows, technology aids in what we're doing. That doesn't seem to have a significant effect on the emergence of certain types of global pessimism today. All right, economic pessimism and certainly climate pessimism are starting to interfere with that narrative. But I guess I'm pushing against, from a religious standpoint, right, whether optimism is the message. Because optimism itself, that's the Fukuyama problem, optimism itself doesn't always get borne out by history. The only version of the march through the wilderness that is optimistic that gets borne out by history, as Walzer says at the end of Exodus and Revolution, is the only way through the wilderness, the only way from here to there is by linking arms and marching. The only way to do it. But there has been, I guess what I'm talking about is almost like when optimism is lazy. By the way, hope can be lazy. Right? Your message is not to give people hope. That's a terrible thing to do sometimes. You're a terminal patient. Is my message to you to give you hope and optimism that you will emerge from something? In contrast, what tools can I give you to navigate this difficult journey you're about to go on? So part of this is also a reminder that there are limits to what we as North American Jews can do to move the story here. We have responsibility for the ideology, the health and belief of our people, and that we will be better partners to Israelis and Palestinians if we have a little bit more of a prosaic sensibility of how much it's going to take to get from point A to point B, rather than being their partners across the water who have a kind of hope and optimism that they're going to be able to sort this out that many of them have given up on. It's almost an internal empathy that we need for the complexity of the problem, precisely for us to be able to start building the pathway towards addressing it. I'll take one last one. Yeah.
If I could get a show of hands.
Any last one? Okay, I think there's one right here.
So I just wanted to problematize a little bit the way that you, but I think you in the spirit of Fukuyama, define or characterize the liberalism that he believed was triumphant and that we now are seeing as perhaps, if not
Teetering.
dead, then certainly, yeah, teetering, in crisis. And I think that he, in his analysis, and you in then building on it, kind of stop at the level of a liberalism that is a political system or set of institutions. But I think that underlying that in Western philosophical thought is a liberalism that is akin to the Haskalah, that says that liberalism at its core puts responsibility on the individual, qua individual, for who they are and the choices they make and so forth, and strips them of the context of demographics and you know, social identity and so forth. And what has happened, you know, and so then when Fukuyama says that religion or what was his other great evil?
Just have to
Nationalism were at odds with this. It's not because they necessarily are unbending, although they may indeed be, but it's because both of those, again,
strip agency from the individual.
Yeah, they put them right back into this categorical class assignment. And the relevance of that to our situation today is that I think that in many ways that we, on the one hand, as liberal Jews, have held up Judaism and have held up Zionism as reflected in Israel and its emergence as a society that then allowed an individual to define his or herself based on individual merits, and allowed a whole society to define itself based on merits, but then started carving out room based on this class identity, and so made exceptions to all the ways in which individual or collective merit didn't square with what we were seeing. And now our kids are seeing that, and they're accepting that class identification and saying, but I don't like what it translates.
Correct. That's a good analysis. I would say one of the clear antidotes in response is that Fukuyama takes for granted that it's going to be you'll have this liberal order which will clash against religion and nationalism and ultimately will win, instead of what could be the more modest and strategic approach, which is, how do you respond to illiberal religion with liberal religion? How do you respond to illiberal nationalism with liberal nationalism? And again, that goes to, are you willing to embrace the tensions and paradoxes between the individual and the collective that are conveyed by those ideas, and do the work to get through them? And because if you do, you'll have something magical on the other end. Right? That's what I know the project of many rabbis in America is, to actually make the case for passionate liberal religion, not to yield religion to the illiberal folks, and not to yield liberalism to the irreligious. Like that's the exact dance. But as we all know, that work itself is extremely hard. And that's the precise example of, I have to be unwilling to allow the mere flow of history to confirm my complicated commitments. I have to actually dwell in that complicated wilderness and work through it as the only possible strategy for winning history. Thanks, everybody.